In a back garden on a terraced street in York, archaeologists once lifted the soil away from the bones of a young man who had been beheaded with a single clean stroke. He died while Britain was still a province of Rome, sometime in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century. For years, he was just one more body in a cemetery full of headless men, the kind of grave that asks questions no one can answer. But in 2025, a team of geneticists ran his DNA through a method built to see what older techniques had missed. And the result moved a date that every schoolbook in the English-speaking world treats as settled. Roughly a quarter of this Roman-era man's ancestry came from Scandinavia, generations before the first Viking longship was ever meant to touch a British shore. To understand why that single skeleton matters, you have to start with the story most of us were taught. It is a tidy story, and that is exactly the problem. The sequence goes like this. First came the ancient Britons, the Iron Age Celtic-speaking peoples who built the hill forts and farmed the chalk downs. Then, in 43 CE, the legions of Rome arrived, and for nearly 4 centuries, Britain was an imperial province with roads and walls and a garrison town in the north called Iberacum, the place we now call York. Around the year 410, Rome let go, and the legions withdrew. Into that vacuum, the textbooks tell us, came the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples crossing the North Sea from the 5th century onward, bringing the language that would become English. And then, last of all, came the Norse. In 793, raiders fell on the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast, and that single bloody morning is treated as the curtain rising on the Viking Age. Celts, then Romans, then Anglo-Saxons, then Vikings. 4 layers, stacked in order, each one arriving after the last, had settled. It is clean. It is easy to teach. And for more than 1,000 years, it was the only version of events anyone had, because it was built almost entirely from written chronicles, place names, and the style of brooches and pottery dug out of the ground. Those sources can tell you what people wrote down and what they made. They cannot tell you who those people actually were or where their grandparents came from. But bone can, and the bone has started to talk. Let us go back to that grave in York. The cemetery is called Driffield Terrace, and it was excavated by the York Archaeological Trust across 2004 and 2005, when a development on a quiet residential street pulled back the ground on something strange. The team uncovered more than 80 burials, the edge of a much larger Roman cemetery laid out along a road leading out of the city. Almost all of the dead were adult men, most of them young, and the great majority had been decapitated, their skulls placed beside them, on their chests, between their legs, or at their feet. Their bones told a hard story: childhood deprivation, healed injuries, the heavy build of men who had spent their lives using weapons. Archaeologists have argued ever since about who they were. Gladiators, brought to fight in the arena of a Roman city, soldiers, executed prisoners, perhaps all 3. Across the years, the cemetery was in use. In 2016, a team from Trinity College Dublin, led by the researcher Rui Martiniano, did something that had never been done before. They sequenced whole genomes from 7 of these Roman Britons. It was the first genome-wide look at the ancient people of Britain, and most of the results pointed where you might expect. The men's closest living relatives were not in Yorkshire at all, but in Wales, a reminder of how much the map of British ancestry has shifted since Roman times. One man stood apart with origins in the Middle East, and one more was flagged as something the researchers could only call an outlier. His ancestry did not fit the others. They could see he was different. They simply did not yet have the tools to say exactly how. There was a second clue in that same 2016 study, and it pointed the other way. The team also sequenced a man from a later Anglo-Saxon era Christian cemetery at Norton in Teesside. His genome leaned clearly toward modern East Anglia and the Dutch, a preview of the continental tide that was still to come. So even in that first small sample, you could already see two different worlds in the bone. An older Briton whose closest living kin sat in Wales, and an incoming Briton whose kin sat across the North Sea. The data was whispering the real story a full decade before anyone had the tools to read it properly. That outlier from York was catalogued with a code, 6DT3. And for nearly a decade, the precise nature of his difference sat in the data, waiting. Here is the difficulty the geneticists were up against. When you compare ancient populations across Northern Europe, so many of them look alike in the genome that the standard methods blur together. An Iron Age Briton, an early Scandinavian, a continental Saxon. They share so much deep ancestry that telling them apart with older statistics was like trying to read a signature through frosted glass. You could see that writing was there. You could not make out the name. In January of 2025, that changed. A study published in the journal Nature introduced a new analytical method with a quiet, almost botanical name: Twigstats. The idea is elegant. Instead of weighing every genetic difference between populations, including the ancient differences that everyone in the region shares, the method builds genealogical trees from the DNA and then focuses only on the recent mutations, the freshest twigs at the very tips of the branches. Those recent changes are where genetically similar peoples actually diverge. By looking only there, the frosted glass clears, and the signature comes into focus. The team behind it, with first author Leo Speidel and the geneticist Marina Silva among the lead names, applied Twigstats to more than 1,500 European genomes spanning the entire first millennium. And when they turned the method on that old York outlier, the man from grave 6DT3, the answer finally came through clean. About 25% of his ancestry traced to the early Iron Age Scandinavian peninsula. Sit with the dates for a moment, because they are the whole point. This man was buried in Roman York in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century. The Anglo-Saxon migrations, the ones the textbooks credit with the first big continental influx, do not begin until the 5th century. The Viking Age does not begin until 793. And here is a man with a full quarter of his ancestry from Scandinavia, lying in the ground generations before either of those waves was supposed to arrive. In the words of the study itself, this documents that people with Scandinavian-related ancestry were already in Britain before the 5th century. Now, this is the moment where a lesser channel would shout the word Viking and roll the credits. I want to slow down, because the truth here is more interesting than the hype, and you deserve the real version. This man was not a Viking. The Vikings, as a cultural phenomenon, the raiders and traders and settlers of the longships, do not exist yet in his lifetime. What he carried was Scandinavian ancestry, the genetic inheritance of people from the Scandinavian peninsula, arriving in Britain through the ordinary machinery of the Roman world. The Roman army recruited across its frontiers and moved soldiers vast distances. Trade and slavery moved people too. A man could end up dead in a York cemetery carrying the DNA of the far north without ever having heard of a longship. So the reveal is not that Vikings raided early. It is something quieter and, frankly, harder to unsee. The genetic thread we tend to call Viking blood, the Scandinavian signal that so many people with British roots find in their DNA results, did not begin with the Viking Age. It was woven into the population of Britain centuries earlier, layer beneath layer, long before anyone gave it a dramatic name. The longships did not introduce that ancestry. They added to a deposit that was already there. And the same study found that the traffic ran in both directions. Across the early part of the first millennium, Twigstats detected at least 2 separate streams of Scandinavian-related ancestry, pushing out across Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, turning up in places as far-flung as southern Germany, Italy, Poland, and Slovakia. One individual recovered in southern Europe carried entirely Scandinavian-like ancestry. Then, later, the current reversed. Toward the end of the Iron Age, roughly between 300 and 800 Common Era, the researchers traced a fresh wave of people moving north, back into Scandinavia itself, carrying Central European ancestry with them. That northward shift happened just before the Viking Age, not during it. An isotope work on teeth from burials on the Swedish island of Åland showed these newcomers had grown up locally. In other words, the Scandinavia that launched the Vikings was itself being remade by migration in the centuries beforehand. The North was never a sealed reservoir of pure Viking stock. It was a crossroads, like everywhere else. If you are finding this useful, take a second to subscribe. This channel digs into the forensic genetics beneath Anglo-sphere ancestry every week, the studies that quietly rewrite who we think we are. Now let me show you how much deeper that deposit goes, because a single skeleton, however striking, is just one data point. The real weight of evidence arrived this year. In 2026, Marina Silva and her colleagues at the Crick Institute in London released the largest study of its kind ever attempted for these islands. They sequenced 1,039 ancient genomes from across Britain, the great majority of them from the first millennium of the Common Era, and they reconstructed ancestry, burial by burial, period by period. I want to be straight with you about its status, because this audience pays attention. As of this recording, that study is a preprint. It has been posted publicly, but has not yet completed peer review, so the precise figures may shift before final publication. Treat the numbers as strong but provisional, and watch for the journal version. With that said, the pattern it reveals is remarkable. Through the Roman centuries, Britain stayed overwhelmingly local. Only about 20% of Roman period individuals carried any detectable ancestry from outside Britain, and what foreign ancestry there was clustered in the cities and the military sites, places like York, Winchester, and Gloucester, exactly where you would expect an empire to deposit outsiders. The York man was unusual, but he was not alone in being unusual. The Roman world was leaking people into Britain the whole time, in a thin, urban trickle. The same dataset turned up details that have nothing to do with migration at all, the kind of intimate texture only 1,000 genomes can give you. In the Iron Age, before Rome, the researchers found a pattern of close kin unions tied to matrilineal burial practices, families organized and laid to rest along the mother's line, a structure that was disrupted in the generations after the Roman conquest. They could even measure how tightly communities were bound to place. Relatives buried at rural sites tended to lie within about 15 kilometers of one another, roughly 9 miles. The radius of a farming world you could walk across in a day. Relatives connected to military sites turned up as far as 50 kilometers apart, the longer reach of soldiers and the people who followed armies. This is forensic genealogy at the scale of a whole island, and it is built, in part, by imputing hundreds of millions of genetic variants against the modern UK Biobank, the very database used in medical research today. The ancient dead and the living are being read with the same ruler. Then comes the break. From the 6th century onward, the study finds a sweeping influx of new continental ancestry in more than 70% of individuals in southern Britain, the region the textbooks call Anglo-Saxon. This was not a thin trickle. This was a genuine transformation of the population across a wide stretch of the island, and it matches, in its scale and timing, the migrations the old chronicles described. So, the Anglo-Saxon arrival was real, and it was big. The textbook was not wrong about that. It was just wrong about the order, and about how clean the layers underneath really were. And the layering kept going. From the 7th century onward, the same study sees ancestries linked to Central and Southern Europe becoming more common across Britain, another thin current laid down on top of the Anglo-Saxon deposit, long before the Normans arrived. Meanwhile, in the north and west, in much of what is now Scotland, and in pockets of Wales, Somerset, and Cornwall, many individuals still carried almost entirely Iron Age British ancestry. The transformation was real, but it was uneven, a patchwork that varied from one valley to the next, which makes the next finding all the more striking. And there is a detail in this new data that drives the early Scandinavian point home from a completely different direction. Far to the north, in what is now Scotland, the researchers examined burials from a Pictish cemetery at a site called Lochhead Quarry. The Picts are the people you would least expect to carry a northern foreign signal in this period, and yet 2 individuals there carried roughly 21 to 23% ancestry linked to Iron Age Scandinavia, once again dated before 793, before the first recorded raid. The Scandinavian thread is turning up at opposite ends of Britain, in a Roman cemetery in the south, and a Pictish one in the north, in eras the timeline insists it should not exist. 2 studies, 2 regions, the same uncomfortable conclusion. The northern ancestry was here early, and it was here in more than one place. So what did the Great Anglo-Saxon Wave actually leave behind in the people of these islands? For that, we turn to a 3rd study, published in Nature back in 2022 by Joshua Gretzinger, Duncan Sayer, and their colleagues. They analyzed 278 ancient genomes from England alongside hundreds more from the continent, and they measured the migration with real precision. In parts of eastern England, in the early medieval period, individuals derived as much as 76% of their ancestry from the continental North Sea zone, the coastal regions of what are now the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. That is not a light cultural veneer. That is large-scale settlement by families who crossed the sea and stayed. But it was never a simple replacement, and the burials themselves show the human friction. At a cemetery called Apple Down in Sussex, around half the ancestry was continental, yet people of local and incoming descent were buried in visibly different styles, a hint of social separation between neighbors who shared the same ground. The study found something else that cuts against the old image of conquering warriors. Women with immigrant ancestry were more often buried with grave goods than local women, while the men laid to rest with weapons were just as likely to be of native British descent as of continental stock. The picture that emerges is not an army wiping out a population. It is two peoples living side by side, intermarrying, sorting themselves by custom and status in ways we are only now able to see. But ancestry does not freeze. Later movements diluted and reshaped that signal, adding, among other things, a southwestern European component related to Iron Age France. By the time you reach the present-day English, the continental Anglo-Saxon fraction averages, by the most commonly cited estimates, on the order of a third, though it varies a great deal by region, and you should check the exact figures against the paper before quoting them. What stays consistent is the affinity. Genetically, the modern English sit close to their North Sea neighbors, the Dutch, the Danes, and the Northern Germans. The chronicles told us the Saxons came. The genome confirms they came in force, and that a real piece of that continental inheritance is still riding in the blood of England today. Now layer all of this together, because this is where it stops being a story about England and becomes a story about a great many of the people watching. Picture British ancestry not as four neat strata stacked in order, but as a riverbed. At the bottom, the deep Iron Age Britons, the people Rome found when it arrived. Above them, a thin Roman era scattering of outsiders, including that quarter Scandinavian man in York, and far to the north, the Scandinavian carrying Picts of Lochhead Quarry. Then the heavy continental deposit of the Anglo-Saxon centuries, more than 70% of southern burials remade. Then the Norse of the recorded Viking age, settling the Danelaw and the islands and the coasts. Then the Normans and everyone after. The layers are not clean. They blur into one another. They reach back earlier than we drew the lines. And the Scandinavian thread in particular runs far deeper down the bed than 793 ever allowed. And here is the twist that turns the whole textbook on its head. The event we treat as one of the great ruptures of British history, the Norman conquest of 1066, the year every English speaker can recite, is almost invisible in the genome. The Norman ruling class rewrote the language of power, the laws, and the names of the great families. But in the DNA of the ordinary people who lived through it, the conquest barely registers as a ripple. What the chronicles record as a violent break, the bone records as quiet continuity. It is a humbling reminder that the moments history shouts about and the moments that actually reshaped a population are not always the same moments at all. Here is why that matters on this side of the Atlantic. A great share of American founding stock, especially across the South and up into the Appalachian backcountry came out of exactly these islands. The English of the Eastern Shore. The Scots-Irish who poured into the mountains in the 18th century, carrying ancestry from the Anglo-Scottish borders and the Ulster plantations, regions soaked in both Anglo-Saxon and Norse heritage. When you take an ancestry DNA or a 23andMe test today, and you see that band of Scandinavian or Germanic ancestry sitting next to your British and Irish results, the easy assumption is that a Viking put it there in the 9th or 10th century. The ancient genomes are telling you the timeline is longer than that. The Scandinavian signal in a person of British descent may indeed come from a Norse settler of the Viking age. But thanks to the man in grave 6DT3 and the pics of Lockhead Quarry, we now know it could just as easily descend from a current that was already moving through Britain in Roman times, or even earlier, carried by people who would have been baffled to hear themselves called Vikings. The blood was in the ground before the name was ever written down. That is the quiet power of ancient DNA. It does not flatter the tidy story. It does not respect the curtain we hung at 793, or the line we drew at the 5th century. It reaches down through every layer and tells you that the people who became the British, and through them a great many Americans, were always a mixture, always older and more tangled than the chronicles let on. Your ancestry is not a single founding moment. It is sediment, laid down over 1,000 years and more, and the deepest layers are only now coming into focus. The man in the York grave never knew his name would do this. He was buried as an outlier, a puzzle, a body that did not fit. Nearly 2,000 years later, he turned out to be a witness. And what he testifies to is simple. The story was never as straight as the line we drew through it. If this changed how you think about your own results, leave a comment with the ancestry breakdown your test gave you, and tell us where your family's roots reach back to. We read them, and the regional patterns you share often point us toward the next study worth digging into. Subscribe, and we will keep following the bone wherever it leads.